Michael Bennett believed he understood how the world worked. In boardrooms overlooking Manhattan skylines and private meetings that moved billions of dollars with a signature, he had seen ambition, arrogance, and quiet power in every form imaginable. But on that particular Tuesday morning, standing inside the grand marble lobby of Hawthorne National Bank, he was about to witness something far more revealing than any corporate negotiation. He was about to watch how people treated someone they believed had no power at all. The bank itself looked exactly like the kind of place that made ordinary visitors feel small. Sunlight poured through 40-foot glass windows, reflecting across polished marble floors that stretched across the lobby like a mirror. Crystal chandeliers hung high above rows of mahogany desks, and the quiet hum of business carried through the air as sharply dressed clients discussed investments and transfers measured not in dollars but in millions. To most people in the room, appearances mattered. Tailored suits, designer handbags, polished shoes that clicked softly across the floor. In a place like this, clothing often spoke louder than introductions. That was why, when Clara Bennett walked through the revolving doors that morning, several heads turned almost immediately. She didn't look like the typical Hawthorne National customer. Her sweater was a simple soft gray, the kind someone might wear on a quiet Saturday afternoon. Her jeans were neat but unremarkable, and the canvas tote over her shoulder looked more suited for a farmer's market than one of the most exclusive banks in Boston. Yet Clara moved with a calm confidence that didn't match the simplicity of her clothes. She paused for a moment near the entrance, taking in the quiet echo of conversations around her before walking toward the main service desk. A few customers glanced at her with curiosity, the way people sometimes watch someone who seems slightly out of place in an expensive restaurant. Clara didn't appear to notice. She simply approached the counter where a sharply dressed woman stood reviewing documents on a tablet. The woman's name badge read Vanessa Price, Senior Client Manager. Vanessa had built her reputation inside the bank on efficiency, control, and a certain strict interpretation of who truly belonged in Hawthorne National. When she looked up and saw Clara standing there, her eyes flicked quickly from the canvas tote to the worn sneakers before settling into a polite but unmistakably distant expression. Across the vast lobby, on the upper mezzanine overlooking the banking floor, Michael Bennett stood beside the bank CEO, finishing a brief phone call about a venture capital project in Silicon Valley. From that vantage point, he could see nearly the entire room below like a carefully arranged stage. At first, he wasn't paying attention to the interaction forming at the front desk. But within minutes, something about the scene began to pull his focus downward. Because standing calmly at that counter was Clara Bennett, the woman who preferred quiet bookstores to luxury parties, the woman who had built scholarships for hundreds of students without ever putting her name on a plaque. And although no one in that lobby seemed to realize it yet, the next few minutes would reveal far more about the character of that room than any financial statement ever could. Vanessa Price studied Clara Bennett for a moment with the practiced patience of someone who had spent years deciding within seconds who deserved her full attention and who did not. Hawthorne National Bank was not an ordinary bank, and Vanessa reminded herself of that fact every morning when she walked past the marble columns and polished brass signage near the entrance. Their clients were executives, investors, and families whose wealth stretched back generations. The environment was curated carefully, and in Vanessa's mind that meant protecting the atmosphere of exclusivity at all costs. Clara waited calmly at the counter, placing her canvas tote gently on the polished surface as if she had done the same thing in places like this many times before. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but steady. She explained that she wanted to open a new account connected to an educational foundation and deposit a check that had been issued from a recent charity event. Vanessa listened, though her attention drifted immediately to Clara's clothing again. The gray sweater looked comfortable rather than expensive. The jeans were clean but simple, and the bag beside her did not carry the kind of designer label Vanessa was used to seeing among the bank's preferred clients. A faint, controlled smile appeared on Vanessa's face, the kind customer service employees learned to wear when they believed someone had misunderstood where they were. She explained that Hawthorne National specialized in managing significant financial portfolios and that most new accounts of that type were usually arranged through scheduled appointments with the private client division. Her words sounded polite, but the tone carried an unmistakable hint of dismissal. Clara listened without interrupting. She simply nodded once and clarified that the account would be receiving a large deposit intended to fund scholarships for several community colleges in Massachusetts. She mentioned the amount quietly, as if the number itself did not matter very much. Vanessa's eyes flicked briefly toward the check Clara had placed on the counter, but she did not reach for it. Instead, she leaned back slightly, folding her hands together in front of her tablet. Around them, the quiet rhythm of the bank continued. Conversations about investment portfolios drifted softly across the lobby. A man in a navy suit signed documents near the investment desk, while a woman wearing a pearl necklace discussed mortgage refinancing with another advisor. Yet the interaction at Vanessa's station had begun attracting subtle attention. A young associate organizing paperwork nearby slowed his movements just enough to listen. Two customers waiting in line exchanged a curious glance. Vanessa lowered her voice slightly, but not enough that the nearby listeners could not hear. She explained again that accounts involving substantial funds normally required verification and appointments arranged through the proper channels. Then she added, with a small tilt of her head, that sometimes smaller community banks were more flexible when it came to walk-in transactions. Clara did not react with frustration or embarrassment. Instead, she offered the same calm expression she had worn when she first walked into the building. She gently turned the check so that the printed amount faced Vanessa and said that she had been told by someone from the bank's foundation outreach team that opening the account in person would be the easiest process. The check sat on the marble counter between them like a quiet challenge, its value printed clearly in bold ink. Vanessa glanced at the number again, and for a brief moment something close to uncertainty crossed her face before her expression hardened once more. Across the lobby, Michael Bennett had finished his conversation and now rested his hands lightly on the railing of the mezzanine balcony. From that vantage point, he could not hear every word being spoken below, but he could read people well enough to understand the tone of an exchange long before the conversation reached its conclusion. And as he watched, Clara standing patiently at the counter while Vanessa continued speaking with controlled authority, a subtle shift passed through his expression. Because the situation unfolding on that marble floor was beginning to reveal exactly the kind of judgment Clara had always warned him about. Vanessa Price kept her posture straight as she glanced once more at the check resting on the marble counter. The number printed across the paper was large enough that it should have drawn immediate attention from any banking professional. Yet something about the situation continued to irritate her. Years inside Hawthorne National had taught her that real wealth usually arrived with unmistakable signals. Clients who handled serious money rarely walked in without assistance, without appointments, and certainly without the quiet, casual appearance of someone carrying a canvas tote bag. She tapped lightly on her tablet screen, pulling up the bank's internal account request form as if performing a routine check, though her tone made it clear she still believed Clara had misunderstood something. Vanessa explained that deposits of that size typically required several layers of identity verification and coordination with the bank's private financial services department. She said the words slowly, emphasizing the process as if speaking to someone unfamiliar with how high-level banking worked. Clara listened with the same calm patience she had shown since arriving. Her hands rested gently on the counter while the low murmur of the lobby continued behind her. She explained that the funds had been raised through a statewide education fundraiser supporting scholarships for students attending community colleges across Massachusetts. The foundation had hosted the event 3 weeks earlier at a civic center outside Boston, and the donation represented the first wave of contributions that would be distributed to partner schools. Clara described it in a tone that suggested she cared far more about the students than about the money itself. Vanessa nodded slightly, though the polite expression on her face had grown thinner. She mentioned that charitable organizations usually coordinated directly with financial institutions in advance when handling large deposits. Her eyes moved again toward Clara's sweater and simple shoes before returning to the check. The subtle judgment in her expression did not go unnoticed by the people waiting nearby. A man standing behind Clara in line adjusted his briefcase and leaned slightly to see the amount printed on the paper. 2 younger employees at a side desk slowed their work just enough to listen. The room itself seemed to sense the tension forming at the counter. Clara noticed the attention gathering around them, but did not react. She only turned the check slightly so Vanessa could read the full amount more clearly. The figure printed on the document was enough to fund hundreds of student scholarships over the next several years. Vanessa studied it again, and for a brief second the confident rhythm of her voice faltered. The number clearly did not match the assumptions she had formed only moments earlier. Still, instead of reaching for the check, she leaned forward slightly and asked Clara whether she had an existing account with Hawthorne National or if someone from the bank had personally scheduled this visit. The question carried an edge that sounded less like procedure and more like doubt. Clara answered honestly. She said she had spoken with a representative from the bank's nonprofit partnership division who recommended opening the account directly at the main branch so the funds could begin processing immediately. She added that the scholarship deadlines for several schools were approaching within the next 60 days, and she wanted the program running as soon as possible. Her voice remained warm and measured, completely unaffected by the subtle challenge in Vanessa's tone. From the mezzanine above, Michael Bennett watched the exchange unfold with increasing attention. He could not hear every detail, but he had spent enough years reading negotiations to understand when someone was being quietly dismissed. Clara had always believed that how people treated strangers revealed far more about their character than how they treated powerful clients. As Michael observed Vanessa's posture and the curious glances forming across the marble floor, he began to realize that Clara's quiet theory was about to be demonstrated in front of an entire bank. Vanessa Price let out a small, controlled breath as she straightened the stack of forms beside her tablet. The lobby around them remained calm, but the atmosphere near the counter had changed in a subtle way that experienced bankers recognized immediately. Conversations nearby had slowed. A few clients who had been reviewing documents were now watching quietly. Hawthorne National Bank had always been a place where status moved through the room, almost like a silent language, and moments like this carried a kind of tension that people could sense without anyone raising their voice. Vanessa finally picked up the check, holding it between two fingers as she examined the printed numbers more closely. The amount was unmistakably significant. It was large enough to fund several business investments, and certainly more than enough to justify immediate attention from the bank's financial services department. Yet Vanessa's hesitation had already set a tone that was difficult to reverse. She glanced back at Clara, studying her face with a slightly sharper expression now, as if trying to solve a puzzle that no longer fit the assumptions she had made when Clara first approached the counter. Clara remained composed, her hands resting lightly on the marble surface while she waited. She did not appear offended, impatient, or even surprised. The calmness in her posture made the situation almost more uncomfortable for the people watching. Vanessa cleared her throat and spoke again, this time loud enough that the nearby customers could easily hear her words. She explained that Hawthorne National maintained strict verification procedures for financial transactions involving large sums, particularly when the client relationship had not yet been formally established. Her tone suggested professionalism, but the emphasis in her voice carried an unmistakable hint of suspicion. Clara nodded politely as if she had expected the question. She explained again that the Scholarship Foundation had worked with several financial institutions before, and that documentation verifying the organization's nonprofit status was inside the folder in her tote bag. She began to reach for it, but Vanessa raised a hand slightly as if pausing the gesture. Instead of examining the paperwork immediately, Vanessa leaned back in her chair and folded her arms across the counter. She explained that Hawthorne National typically preferred to handle charitable foundations through their private client department rather than through the general banking desk. Then she added that the private department usually scheduled meetings with representatives weeks in advance so that proper background reviews could be conducted. The implication hung quietly in the air. A man standing several feet behind Clara shifted his weight and whispered something to the woman beside him. One of the junior associates at a nearby workstation glanced toward the counter and then quickly looked down again as if unsure whether to intervene. Clara listened carefully to every word before answering. She spoke in the same calm tone she had used from the beginning and explained that the foundation's financial advisor had recommended opening the account that morning because the funds needed to begin transferring to participating schools within the next 30 days. She added that the events supporting the program had taken place at a convention center outside Boston and had drawn donations from dozens of local businesses. The scholarships would support students pursuing careers in healthcare, engineering, and education. many of whom would be the first in their families to attend college. Her voice carried quiet sincerity, the kind that comes from someone who genuinely believes in what they are doing. For a moment, the marble lobby fell unusually still. Vanessa tapped her tablet again, scrolling through a screen as though searching for confirmation of something that did not appear in the system. Her brows tightened slightly. The check in her hand remained raised just above the counter, and the silence around them stretched long enough for several nearby clients to lean closer in curiosity. Above them, Michael Bennett continued watching from the mezzanine balcony, his eyes following the subtle shift in Vanessa's expression as she looked once more from the check to Clara's quiet, steady face. Vanessa Price slowly placed the check back on the polished marble counter as if she had already reached a conclusion in her mind. The brief hesitation that had crossed her face moments earlier disappeared behind a carefully practiced expression of professional authority. She folded her hands neatly in front of her tablet and looked at Clara Bennett again with the same polite distance she had used when this interaction first began. The surrounding lobby had grown noticeably quieter. Several nearby clients had stopped pretending not to watch, and even the faint clicking of shoes across the marble floor seemed to fade as attention settled around the service desk. Vanessa spoke again, this time with a tone that carried a firmer edge beneath its professional wording. She explained that Hawthorne National Bank took financial verification very seriously and that it was unusual for someone to arrive without a prior appointment when attempting to open a new account involving such a significant deposit. She added that the bank maintained strict standards in order to protect its clients and its reputation. The words sounded procedural, yet the implication was unmistakable. Clara listened without interrupting, her calm expression unchanged. She reached into her canvas tote and gently removed a slim folder containing documents for the foundation. The folder held official registration papers, tax identification forms, and letters confirming the nonprofit organization's partnerships with several Massachusetts colleges. Clara placed the folder on the counter beside the check and slid it forward slightly. She explained that everything necessary to verify the foundation's status was included inside. Vanessa glanced down at the folder but did not open it. Instead, she leaned slightly forward and lowered her voice just enough to make the moment feel more pointed while still allowing the nearby listeners to hear. She said that Hawthorne National normally worked with established philanthropic institutions that had long-standing relationships with the bank. She added that most serious foundations were represented by financial managers or legal advisors rather than individuals walking in alone. A faint murmur passed through the small group of customers standing within earshot. Clara's hands remained resting lightly on the counter. Her voice, when she responded, was as steady as it had been since the beginning. She explained that the foundation preferred to keep its operations simple and direct because the goal was to move funds to students as efficiently as possible. She mentioned that the scholarship program would support hundreds of young people preparing for careers in nursing, public education, and community health programs throughout New England. The program's first round of tuition payments needed to be processed within the next 30 days so the students could register for fall classes. Vanessa listened with an expression that mixed skepticism and impatience. She tapped the edge of her tablet again and glanced briefly toward the security desk near the entrance before returning her attention to Clara. Then she said something that caused several nearby clients to exchange uncomfortable looks. She explained that Hawthorne National could not simply accept large checks from individuals without a clearly established financial history with the bank. She suggested that Clara might have better success opening an account at a smaller regional branch where staff were more accustomed to handling informal walk-in transactions. The suggestion hung in the air like a quiet dismissal. Clara looked at Vanessa for a moment, not with anger but with the calm patience of someone who had experienced this kind of judgment before. Above them on the mezzanine balcony, Michael Bennett straightened slightly against the railing as the meaning of Vanessa's words became unmistakably clear. Because what the people gathered around that marble counter did not yet realize was that the quiet woman standing there had access to resources far beyond what anyone in that room had imagined, and the man watching from above had just decided it was time to walk downstairs. Michael Bennett released his grip on the polished railing of the mezzanine balcony and began walking toward the staircase that curved down to the main lobby. His movements were calm and deliberate, the kind of controlled pace that came from years of entering rooms where every decision carried weight. From above, he had watched the entire exchange unfold with quiet attention. He had seen the way Vanessa Price studied Clara's clothes before listening to her words. He had seen the subtle shift in posture when the check amount became clear. And he had heard enough of the conversation to understand exactly what had happened. Down on the marble floor, Clara Bennett still stood calmly at the service counter. The folder containing the foundation documents rested beside the check, untouched. Vanessa Price had returned her attention to the tablet in front of her, as if the matter had already been decided. The suggestion that Clara should try a smaller bank still lingered in the air, quietly echoing among the small crowd that had gathered within earshot. A few people shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the situation had moved beyond simple procedure and into something more personal. Clara did not raise her voice or protest. She simply nodded once, as though acknowledging that Vanessa had finished speaking. Her hands rested lightly on the marble surface, and for a moment the entire counter area seemed suspended in a strange, watchful silence. Then the sound of footsteps echoed across the lobby. The polished marble floors carried the rhythm clearly as Michael Bennett reached the base of the staircase and began walking across the open space toward the counter. Several employees noticed him immediately. Hawthorne National was not unfamiliar with influential clients, and Michael Bennett was not a man who went unnoticed in financial circles. His presence carried a quiet authority that did not rely on raised voices or dramatic gestures. It was simply the confidence of someone accustomed to moving billions of dollars through markets that most people only read about in headlines. One of the junior associates near the investment desk looked up and straightened instinctively. Another employee whispered something under her breath as recognition spread. Vanessa Price, however, remained focused on her tablet for another moment before finally looking up again. At first, she did not understand why several of her colleagues had suddenly become so attentive. Then she noticed the direction of their gaze. Michael Bennett stopped a few feet from the counter, his expression calm but unmistakably serious. He glanced briefly at the check resting on the marble surface, then at the folder of scholarship documents beside it. Finally, his eyes settled on Clara. For a brief second, the tension in the room softened, and Clara's quiet composure was met with the faintest hint of a reassuring smile. Then Michael turned his attention toward Vanessa. The subtle change in his posture was enough to make the nearby employees fall completely silent. Vanessa's expression shifted the instant she recognized who was standing in front of her. The color drained slightly from her face as realization began to move through her mind faster than she could speak. Because standing at her counter was not simply another client observing the situation. Standing there was one of the most influential investors connected to Hawthorne National Bank. And the quiet woman she had just dismissed was clearly not a stranger to him at all. The marble lobby fell completely silent as recognition spread across the room. Vanessa Price stared at the man standing in front of her, her mind racing as every assumption she had made only minutes earlier began to unravel. Michael Bennett was not simply another client walking into Hawthorne National Bank. His name appeared regularly in financial journals, in headlines discussing major investment funds, and in boardroom conversations that shaped the direction of entire industries. Several of the bank's senior executives had personally met with him during previous investment negotiations. The realization moved across Vanessa's face slowly, replacing her confident professionalism with a sudden stiffness that everyone nearby could see. Michael Bennett did not raise his voice or make any dramatic gesture. Instead, he placed one hand lightly on the marble counter beside the check and the folder of scholarship documents. His posture remained calm, but there was a quiet authority in the way he looked at Vanessa that made the surrounding employees instinctively stop what they were doing. For a moment, no one spoke. The entire lobby seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Michael glanced toward Clara Bennett, his expression softening briefly with familiar warmth before he turned back to Vanessa. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and measured. He asked if there had been some kind of problem with opening the account for the Scholarship Foundation. Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, but hesitated. Only minutes earlier she had spoken with controlled certainty, explaining procedures and standards as though she held complete authority over the situation. Now every word felt far more complicated. She quickly glanced at the check again, then at Clara, then back at Michael as the reality of the situation settled in. Around them, several employees stood perfectly still, One of the junior associates near the investment desk quietly stepped back from his workstation as if trying not to draw attention to himself. A man waiting in line behind Clara adjusted his tie and looked down at the floor, suddenly aware that he had just witnessed the entire exchange. Vanessa cleared her throat and attempted to recover her professional composure. She explained that she had simply been informing Clara about the bank's verification procedures and the usual process for opening accounts involving large deposits. Her tone was careful now, the confidence replaced by an unmistakable hint of unease. Michael listened without interrupting. His eyes briefly moved across the marble counter again, taking in the untouched folder of foundation documents and the check that Vanessa had only moments earlier treated with doubt. Then he asked a quiet question that echoed across the suddenly still lobby. He asked why the documents had not been reviewed if the bank required verification. Vanessa hesitated again. The answer seemed obvious to everyone standing nearby, yet saying it aloud would only confirm what had already happened. Clara remained silent beside him, her calm composure unchanged despite the attention surrounding them. The quiet confidence she carried made the moment feel even more uncomfortable for those watching. Michael finally rested his hand gently over Clara's on the counter in a small gesture that spoke louder than any explanation. The meaning of the interaction became clear to everyone in the room at once. Because the woman Vanessa had dismissed as an uncertain visitor was not simply a stranger attempting to open an account. She was Clara Bennett, and standing beside her was her husband, the same Michael Bennett whose investments had shaped the financial success of institutions far larger than the one whose marble lobby had suddenly grown very quiet. The silence inside. The marble lobby grew heavier with every passing second. Vanessa Price felt the weight of dozens of eyes shifting toward her as the full meaning of the moment settled across the room. Hawthorne National Bank had always operated on quiet displays of status and influence, and now one of the most influential investors connected to the institution was standing calmly at her counter, looking directly at the documents she had chosen not to review. Vanessa quickly straightened the stack of forms beside her tablet, as though trying to regain control of a situation that had already slipped beyond her assumptions. Her voice, when she spoke again, sounded noticeably softer than before. She explained that she had only been attempting to follow proper procedures and that the bank required verification before opening new accounts connected to large financial deposits. Michael Bennett listened carefully without interrupting. His expression remained composed, but there was a clarity in his gaze that made it impossible to ignore the seriousness of the moment. He slowly slid the folder of foundation documents closer to Vanessa across the marble counter and gently tapped the top page with one finger. The simple motion carried a quiet message that everyone nearby understood immediately. Vanessa hesitated before opening the folder. Inside were official nonprofit registration records, partnership letters from multiple Massachusetts colleges, and financial certification documents confirming the Scholarship Foundation's operations. The papers were organized with precise care, each page clearly labeled and professionally prepared. As Vanessa scanned the documents, her posture shifted slightly. The skepticism that had defined her tone earlier began to dissolve into something far more uncertain. Several employees standing nearby leaned subtly closer, aware that the interaction unfolding at the counter had become something far more significant than an ordinary banking request. Michael finally spoke again, his voice calm but firm. He explained that the purpose of the account was to ensure that scholarship funds reached students before the next semester registration deadlines. He mentioned that hundreds of applicants had already been selected through the foundation's review process, many of them young people who would be the first members of their families to attend college. The money represented tuition assistance that would determine whether those students could continue their education that year. Clara stood quietly beside him as he spoke, her expression unchanged. She had never been interested in public recognition for the foundation's work. The scholarships existed simply to open doors for people who might otherwise never have the chance to step through them. Vanessa finished reviewing the first few documents and slowly looked back up at Clara. The confidence she had displayed earlier had completely faded. The realization that she had dismissed someone responsible for such a significant philanthropic effort was now unmistakable. Around them, the lobby remained silent. Even the faint background conversations had stopped as clients and employees waited to see how the moment would resolve. Michael glanced briefly around the room before returning his attention to Vanessa. Then he spoke a sentence that carried through the marble lobby with quiet clarity. He said that financial institutions often measured people by the size of their accounts, but character was revealed by how they treated someone before they knew who that person was. The words were not spoken in anger. They were calm, almost reflective, yet they landed with unmistakable weight. Vanessa lowered her gaze for a moment, understanding that the entire room had just witnessed something far more meaningful than a simple banking transaction. For several seconds, no one in the marble lobby spoke. The quiet that followed Michael Bennett's words settled across the room, like a slow realization spreading from person to person. Vanessa Price remained standing behind the counter with the open folder of documents in her hands. The carefully prepared papers now looked very different from the way they had only minutes earlier when she had dismissed them without review. Each page confirmed the same thing. The Scholarship Foundation was real, professionally organized, and responsible for supporting hundreds of students across Massachusetts. Vanessa gently closed the folder and placed it back on the counter beside the check. Her posture, once rigid with authority, now carried a noticeable hesitation. She looked at Clara Bennett again, this time with an expression that no longer held the quiet judgment from before. The difference was clear to everyone watching. Vanessa spoke carefully, explaining that the account could certainly be opened immediately and that the bank would ensure the deposit was processed without delay. She added that the foundation's work supporting education was admirable and that Hawthorne National would be honored to assist with managing the funds. The words sounded respectful, but they came far later than they should have. Clara listened calmly and offered a small nod in acknowledgement. She did not raise her voice, criticize the earlier treatment, or attempt to embarrass anyone standing in the room. Instead, she simply explained that the goal of the foundation had always been to remove obstacles for students who were trying to build a better future through education. She mentioned that many of the scholarship recipients came from small towns across New England where college had once seemed financially impossible. The funds would help pay for tuition, books, and housing so those students could focus on their studies rather than on financial hardship. As she spoke, several people in the lobby lowered their eyes quietly. The contrast between Clara's calm dignity and the earlier dismissal had become impossible to ignore. Michael Bennett glanced once more around the room before resting his hand lightly on the marble counter. His presence no longer carried tension. Instead, it felt like the quiet closing of a lesson that everyone present had already understood. Vanessa signaled for one of the junior associates to begin processing the account paperwork. The young employee moved quickly, eager to correct the situation as efficiently as possible. Within minutes, the necessary forms were being prepared and the deposit process was underway. Yet the moment that remained in the room had nothing to do with financial procedures. It was the quiet awareness that something deeper had been revealed. Clara gathered the documents from the counter after the initial paperwork was completed. Before leaving, she looked at Vanessa one final time and spoke gently, not with anger, but with calm sincerity. She said that respect should never depend on clothing, titles, or assumptions about wealth. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that no one present could dismiss. Michael and Clara then turned and walked together toward the tall glass doors of the bank. Their footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor as the lobby slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Conversations resumed and employees returned to their desks, but the silence that had filled the room earlier left an impression that lingered long after they were gone. Because on that morning, inside one of the most prestigious banks in the city, everyone who witnessed the moment was reminded of something far more valuable than money. True dignity does not announce itself with appearances. It reveals itself quietly in the way people choose to treat one another.